There's something about an axe murder that seems especially unnerving. Maybe it's the idea that to kill with an axe takes true intent. It's not like it's something that can just happen. An axe is massive and heavy. Swinging one requires brute force. Think of a Norse berserker with his battle axe, or Jack in The Shining. It seems like the weapon of a madman. And in 1715, when Jeramiah Meacham began to show signs of paranoia, it was an axe he turned to. Welcome, I'm Mick Biddick, and this is History is Criminal. In this episode, we'll take a look at Jeramiah Meacham, an axe-wielding killer from 1715, Rhode Island, a man whose personal demons were made worse by a society that, in their own messed up way, might have been trying to help. Much of the information in the story comes from the University of Michigan Library of Digital Collection. This includes Meacham's own personal narrative, a long and sometimes rambling sermon given by the preacher in Newport, Rhode Island, in the days following Meacham's actions. Jeremiah Meacham III was born in 1673 in Salem, Massachusetts, one of 17 children, counting half-siblings. Like any kid living in Salem in the late 1600s, he would have been given a religious education. No evidence exists that says his childhood was out of the ordinary, other than having enough siblings to outfit the starting offense for the Patriots, plus subs. Of course, Salem in the 1680s and 1690s was a society on the edge of disaster, about to make its own infamous mark in history. While there's no witches in the story, it is interesting to note that Meacham would have been about 19 or 20 at the time of the Salem witch trials, and would have been raised in the same fanatical religious environment that led to the insanity of 1692 and 1693. As a child and teen, he seems to have had the same religious convictions as the majority in Salem. Of course, this was a society that laid fines against you for not going to church or working on a Sunday. A Puritan theocracy that viewed any dissent as being signs of the presence of the devil. So, of course, a young Jeremiah Meacham would have been religious. He would have had no choice in the matter. But when he left Salem, he, by his own account, moved away from, quote, things of godliness and more inclined to the ways of wickedness, unquote. Living at first in Providence, he began to pal around with some that were openly wicked. He stopped attending church, but reportedly continued the rest of his normal routines and seemed to be, by all accounts, fair and honest with whom the people he dealt. In 1698, Meacham married. There's some confusion about his wife's name. Some sources call her Free Love Bliss, which, in all honesty, sounds awesome. But this tends to conflict with death records. There's no record of a Free Love Bliss or of the Bliss family having a daughter of that name. Other sources say her name was Patience. All those sources also give that as the name of the Meacham's daughter. It is, of course, highly possible that mother and daughter shared the same name. It's unfortunate that so little attention was paid to women in the official records of the day, that we are unclear of her name. In contemporary written accounts, she's mostly just referred to as Mrs. Meacham. But I'll stick with Patience. In any case, once married, Meacham began to attend family prayers again, but within a year he had drifted away from church services. In New England in the 16 to 1700s, this conflict of religious consciousness would have been something that others would have taken notice of and commented on for sure. This religious tug-of-war may have shaken an already fragile psyche. Meacham, it seems, did not abandon a belief in God. According to reports, he had taken an out-of-ordinary view of religion. It seems that he was questioning the need for a church and a preacher, an idea that would have seemed very radical in the theocratic society of Puritan New England. People reported to the Reverend Nathaniel Clapp that they wanted Meacham to stop sharing his, quote, radical views with them. Most troubling among these radical views was that church attendance was not necessary. While to a modern sensibility this may not seem that radical, to a Puritan at the time, it would have been not only unthinkable, but possibly illegal. The church was the center of most of their lives. It was the focus of spiritual, social, and political life in New England. At this same juncture, Meacham started to show signs of growing paranoia. His paranoia increasing, he started to believe his neighbors were out to kill him. Starting confrontations with his neighbors, asking if they knew of anyone who might want to do him harm. They would reply no, and this would only cause him to grow more suspicious of those around him. In his mind, this all would make perfect sense. The people out to get him would, of course, deny conspiring against him, and their continued denial would only serve to fuel his growing paranoia. It was clear that he understood that there was something wrong, but most likely had no idea what it could be. He confided in some, including the local minister, the Reverend Clapp, that he felt he was, quote, weary of his life. And how did the people of 1570 Newport, Rhode Island respond to his clear cries for help? They said he should drink, and drink a lot. Now, in 1715, no one would have had any idea about what paranoid schizophrenia was, but I can't imagine that people really thought that this was good advice. While Puritans were not opposed to alcohol, they did frown on drunkenness, which makes this advice seem even weirder. Think about going to people and saying, I've been really worried that there are forces out there bent on destroying me. I see enemies everywhere I turn. It seems hopeless. What should I do? And their response, I advise you to start drinking heavily. I believe that's the same advice that Bluto gave to Flounder in Animal House, and while humorous when coming from John Belushi to Stephen Furst, I don't think it's the best mental health practice. Then I am not a licensed therapist. Forget the fact that today we know alcohol to be a depressant and might be among the worst things you can do if you're suffering from serious depression. I can't imagine in the early 1700s people really believed that the best thing to do when someone was depressed was to give them booze. Had they ever walked into Ye Old Pub at 5 o'clock on a weekday? This is not the go-to model for happiness and good times. And that's just the folks who had a bad day at work, not people who are clinically depressed. It was recorded that Meacham was advised to, quote, drink away his troubles to kill his troubles of mind by strong drink to excess. And he owned that when he had tried several times what this way would do, he found by sad experience that this was not the right way to get ease, for troubles in his mind returned as the spirit of drink removed. Now, if you don't get that, he said he tried to treat his paranoia and depression on the advice of family and friends by getting hammered. He's literally told to drink to excess. But to everyone's surprise, when he sobered up, bang, he was paranoid and depressed again. It's almost like getting him drunk didn't solve his problems. So as he spirals out of control, the town folks are like, well, we got him drunk and that didn't work. We're at a loss of what to do. I would love to say that this wouldn't happen today, but suffice it to say, self-medication is still the way many people deal with mental health issues. At least in 1715, they had the excuse of not knowing that psychology was a thing yet. So what happens when a paranoid schizophrenic receives no help and the booze doesn't cut it anymore? In short, crazy shit happens. 21st March 1715. Meacham is observed walking around in an agitated state. arguing with his neighbors and accusing them of plotting against him. When they deny his allegations, he only becomes more convinced of a conspiracy against him. Surprisingly, nobody pointed at him and yelled, "Witch." This was, after all, only 22 years after the end of the Salem witch trials, and the last witch trial in the United States would take place over 163 years later. You heard that correctly. The last witch trial in the United States was in 1878, not the 16 or 1700s. Yes, the telephone was invented 2 years before the last witch trial in the U.S. While there will be some talk of the devil, it doesn't seem that anyone would make the accusations that he was in league with the devil during his actions. Just that murderers in general are children of the devil. As tragic as the witch trials were, in this case, an accusation of witchcraft might have prevented a greater tragedy. As an accused, he would have been locked up and unable to harm anyone. Instead, it seems the general consensus was to just do nothing. People worried that he could possibly harm himself, but he was not a danger to others, so they let him be. And once again, surprise, the crazy just got more crazy. The next morning, the 22nd of March, Meacham is found on his rooftop, holding a penknife, and for the next several hours he sat on the roof yelling at passers-by. He was afraid that somebody was going to hurt him, yelling to the observers that he wouldn't do any harm to anyone if they just left him alone. So just to be clear, you live in a small provincial town in 1715 Rhode Island. A man you know, a neighbor, maybe a friend who has been acting more and more crazy the weeks past, is now on the roof holding a knife, basically telling everyone to just back off and leave him alone, and no one will get hurt. In that situation, the consensus was to just let it happen. Again, his neighbor said they didn't think he was capable of harming others, and after a few hours on the roof, it seems his wife was able to coax him into the house. Never putting down the knife, he now sat in a room on the ground floor. He continued to insist that somebody was out to get him. At some point, his sister-in-law, Content Garcia, came into the home, maybe to give what aid she could to her sister, or maybe just by chance. We don't know. The two women must have tried to talk him out of his growing agitated state, but with no success. By early evening, he had grabbed both an axe and a loaded gun and moved up to the second floor. The exact timing of events after this is unclear. But that evening, he called his wife, Patience, and her sister, Content, to come upstairs. What possessed the woman to follow his directions is unknown, but it seems they were willing to check on his well-being. According to Meacham's own account, as his wife and sister-in-law spoke to him, he became more and more unreasonable. He would later say he could remember the events, but that it wasn't him committing them. When Patience approached Meacham, he took out the penknife and slashed her neck. With no forensics, it is not possible to know when Patience died, and if it was the knife or the axe that would prove fatal. What we do know is that Meacham then started hitting her with the axe. He turned next to Content. The number of blows is unknown, but witnesses said that the dreadful marks of several remained on their miserable, mangled bodies. The bodies would not be removed until after a fire. Even burned the evidence of axe wounds. Even burned, the evidence of axe wounds were still visible to the naked eye. The women didn't go quietly, though. Neighbors rushed to the scene upon hearing the screams. Meacham, most likely seeing this as confirmation of attack on him, fought off the neighbors with the axe, striking at least one but not killing him. Unable to get to him through the doorway and stairs, according to the official account, they reached Meacham by, quote, breaking through the chamber floor below him and the roof above. Now, watching people come through your floor and ceiling is not going to ease your paranoia. But they did at least temporarily get a hold of Meacham. Remember, this is the early 1700s, so the neighbors needed some way to light their path, and they carried torches. Nothing lowers paranoia like a torch-wielding mob. As Meacham attempted to fight off his attackers, he was able to get a torch from one of the neighbors and proceeded to light the room on fire. As the neighbors fled the flames, Meacham made the choice to sit in the room and burn to death. It is unclear when, and even Meacham couldn't say when it happened, but he used the penknife to cut his throat in an apparent attempt to kill himself. When it turned out that this wound was not fatal, Meacham came to the conclusion that he was not going to bleed to death, and the fire had become, in his words, uncomfortable. He then stood and dove headfirst through the second-floor window. He landed headfirst among the crowd gathered outside, axe still in hand. Now too injured to fight, he was taken into custody. 5 days later, the Reverend Clapp made Meacham the focus of his sermon. For Clapp, the tragedy would be a great vehicle to talk about repentance, but also to call for Meacham to be put to death. In a 56-page handwritten sermon, Clapp quotes a great number of biblical sources. From the book of Job, he tells us that murderers are the children of the devil, and that Meacham committed 3 murders, not only the murder of his wife and sister-in-law, but also self-murder. He states that Meacham committed the crime of attempted self-murder when he cut his own throat, but that he actually committed self-murder when he killed his wife. By killing his wife, he committed self-murder because they are one in the thinking of the church and in the eyes of God. This also helps explain why the records of women during this time period are so sketchy. They religiously and legally became part of their husband upon marriage. The Reverend also quotes the book of Numbers. Quote, "This is a man who smite any person with an instrument of iron. He is a murderer, and the murderer shall surely be put to death." Unquote. Not sure what happens if you smite somebody with something else, but don't use iron. He also points out that Meacham used 2 instruments of iron, both the knife and the axe. And then he said that because Meacham had, quote, "defiled the land with blood, it cannot be decreased of its defilement without your death," unquote. Clapp next points out that Meacham killed patients and contents before they could prepare their souls to meet God. He then implores Meacham and his congregation to make their souls right before the Lord. Clapp, the classic Puritan preacher, would never miss a chance to get people to repent. Meacham would stand trial on the 8th of April, 1715. He admitted that he had killed the 2 women, and that, quote, "he did what he did in a hurry." Believing his wife and sister to be part of a plot against him, he said that while he remembered committing the crimes, he was not in his right mind and didn't know he was doing it. Was he in a dissociative state? Today, this could be the basis for an insanity defense, but an insanity defense didn't exist in 1700s Rhode Island. Was Meacham telling the truth? Maybe, but we'll never know. As for the jury, they didn't seem to care much for Meacham's "I didn't know I was doing it" defense. He was found guilty and sentenced to be hanged on the 12th of April, and in early 1700s, there was no appeal. At his execution, Governor Samuel Cranston, at the urging of Reverend Clapp, recorded the events as accurate as he could. Meacham was allowed to take prayer. Cranston took down what Meacham said. He asked Jesus to take his soul and that God look after his 2 children, as they, quote, "have neither father nor mother to look after them," unquote. Gee, I wonder why they have no mother. Then they covered his head, but Meacham asked to see the sun one last time. They did as Meacham asked and removed the sack from his head. He spoke again, talking about how the Lord made the sun and, quote, I pray let the sun, which Cranston recorded as S-U-N, but I think Meacham probably meant S-O-N. The sun of righteousness graciously shine upon my soul. And then, Lord, receive my spirit. A crowd, at this point, said to be in excess of 1,000, watched him hang. I'm not a psychologist, but even a layperson can see that Meacham was suffering. And while my unprofessional diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia might miss the mark, there's no doubt that he was suffering from some mental illness. People saw this, and their only recourse was to tell him to drink, and drink some more. Puritan society normally frowned upon drunkenness, so it seems odd that this would be their solution. It's also unclear what resources, if any, would have been available to Meacham in 1715. The first mental hospital in the American colonies wouldn't open until 1773, and patients didn't receive care as much as were just housed there. And while Quakers did try to care for the mentally ill, others saw mental illness as, at best, a personal failing and, as at worst, tied to the devil. The Reverend Clapp even implied that Meacham had committed the murders because of some type of connection with Satan. New England society of the late 16 and early 1700s were convinced that the God and the devil were playing daily games for their immortal souls. Mental illness was often called possession, or even sometimes werewolfery, and the victims often placed on trial for witchcraft or being in league with the devil. As the Enlightenment spread, the trials became fewer and fewer, dying out in Europe in the 1700s and in America, again, in the 1800s. But help for those suffering from mental illness still lagged behind. Even today, the percentage of mentally ill who are homeless or in jails is staggering. And too often, this turns tragic because people, through ignorance or worse, willful ignorance, fail to help. Would Jeramiah Meacham's story have ended differently today? That's unclear. It could have ended in a police shooting, as Meacham, armed with a knife and axe and gun, was confronted by police. Or it might have ended the same tragic way, as people chose not to get involved or just didn't know what to do or who to call. I would like to think today that Meacham would get the help he needed before he climbed on that roof and started yelling about his paranoid delusions. But I fear he wouldn't. This has been History is Criminal. Join us in 2 weeks as we take a look at Mary Ann Cotton, a woman who would make her mark in history as England's first female serial killer.